Hello, my name is Laurel Collins, and along with my co-host Michael Prince, we will be hosting this segment of Voting for Change. Today we have as our guest David Merner, who is on the Council for Fair Vote Canada. In November, the public will be asked to choose between a proportional representation system or the current system of first past the post. Fair Vote Canada has been advocating for change. Why do you think change is necessary?
We think that we can do much better than our current system. Our current system has a lot of flaws to it. One of them is that it sometimes generates wrong winners. In other words, one party will get more votes than another, but the other party will form the government, which doesn't seem fair. Also, in our system, voters are typically not voting for anybody who gets elected. Over 50% of British Columbians in the last provincial election voted for candidates who didn't get elected. In proportional representation systems, you can do much better than that. Sometimes 95% of voters will vote for somebody who actually gets elected. So in our democracy, we're saying there are much better ways of electing our members of the Legislative Assembly, and that's what we're working for.
Proportional representation has often resulted in coalition governments. Can you describe some of the pros and cons of that?
Yeah, some people say that it makes forming a government more difficult, which is true. In some countries like Germany recently, it's taken months to form a government. But we say that that's a healthy process. It's much healthier to have our politicians and political leaders working together, finding compromise, figuring out what's in the public interest. And you see that in BC right now. There's some controversy around the current government, but it's working. We have two leaders of political parties who have come to a compromise and have made it work. And it looks like it'll probably work for 4 years. So you look at the evidence in British Columbia, and even look at the worst case scenarios like Germany, the elected leaders do figure out how to come together and govern in proportional systems, but critics will say it takes longer. Yes, that's true. It does. Compromise sometimes takes longer.
What about the criticism you've no doubt heard many times, David, about it gives a third party, like in this case in BC, the Green Caucus, a disproportionate amount of influence, that they won 3 seats, about 17% of the popular vote. Some people would say they're the tail wagging the dog.
Yeah.
They've got much more clout than perhaps they even deserve. So what's thoughts on that?
Again, look at BC and you look at some of the decisions the NDP government has made around Site C. Very unpopular with Greens, very unpopular with the Green Caucus, and yet they were able to go ahead and make that decision. So the tail wagging the dog argument certainly doesn't hold true in British Columbia. There are some countries, I think, perhaps Israel is a good example, where they have unusual proportional representation rules. And it is possible, for example, in Israel, for small religiously based parties to hold sort of disproportionate power. But nobody in Canada is arguing we should adopt Israel's system or Italy's system. We're saying, look at Germany or look at the Scandinavian countries. They have very good systems, often with a threshold. You have to get 5% of the vote in order to get a seat in the national legislature. We're saying that's the kind of, Germany, the Scandinavian countries, those are the kind of countries we should be looking to, not Israel or Italy.
So I can pick up on that 5%, because I no doubt we're going to be hearing over the coming months as the referendum heats up about fringe parties. And as moving to a proportional representation, it's going to invite everybody out of the woodwork and the forests of BC to, we already have multiple parties running elections. Many of them only get 500 votes, 1,000 votes, maybe a few thousand votes. But what about that as a concern, that this is going to fragment the party system or complicate it and encourage what some people call one-issue parties or fringe parties into the process?
I think there is some basis for that. For example, I think it's likely that the provincial Liberals will probably fragment. I see conservatives, true conservatives, actually forming their own party and getting seats in the legislature. So I see that as possible. But the idea that extremist parties will take over, I don't think that's realistic in our political culture. Even in sort of Germany or in the Netherlands, where they do actually have some fringe political support, the extremist parties are really marginalized, and they don't form government. They never form government. Contrast that with the United States, where we have a fellow who's the president of the United States, who many would characterize as extremist, really outside the American political culture.
Right.
And he was able to grab power by taking over one of the mainstream parties,
Yep.
the Republican Party, which is really struggling with its identity now, right?
Absolutely.
So I would say there's much more danger around extremist takeovers in first-past-the-post systems. We see it in the south of the border.
Okay.
Now,
We are a number of months out from the referendum, and we haven't really heard what the ballot question is going to be. What's your take on what it might be? What's kind of your preference?
I don't know what it'll be, but my sense is that a very clear and clean question is something that will appear to be more fair. From an activist point of view, from a proportional representation activist point of view, I'd love a very simple question that, do you want change or do you want the same old broken system? But I don't think they're going to go with that. I think they're
Slightly loaded wording there, David.
The other thing is whether they have one or two questions, right? We talked about that earlier. And I think that it might be a good idea to have more than one question. Say one on a high level, fair question, do you want a change? But then I think it's inevitable that we'll have to get into some of the details, and I think you will in future shows, around what kind of system would you vote for?
Right.
And then give British Columbians a chance to vote on the various different systems. I think that makes sense to me. It sounds fair to me, and it'll give some guidance to the legislators who will have to decide which system to pick. So my personal preference, and I think from just media reports, the government might be interested in going this way, is having a two-question referendum.
You touched a little bit on the complexity issue. That's one of the biggest critiques from the kind of no side you often hear, is that proportional representation is complicated, that voters don't understand it. This is going to be our third referendum. What's your response to the complication issue?
Again, over 80% of OECD countries, developed countries, have proportional representation. Ireland, Malta, we mentioned already, Germany, and so on. And those voters can figure out how to vote in those countries. I'm sure British Columbians are just as smart as the Irish or the Maltese or the Germans, right? We should be able to figure it out. I think our standard line in the proportional representation community is, well, when you get in the car, you don't necessarily know how the internal combustion engine functions, you just know how to turn on the key. So for voters, the key is, how do you get this system? How do you vote in the system? And that's not complicated. The other thing is, critics will say, well, counting the ballots can be complicated, and there's some truth in that. Complicated, especially in a preferential ballot where you're marking 1, 2, 3, 4, right? In some of the systems, there's some truth to the fact that it is complicated, but it's also true that you have experts running the counts. You have political party activists who are there scrutinizing the count. You have BC elections folks who are running the count. So we have systems in place to deal with the complications of counting ballots. So I'm not really concerned, and I think it's a little bit unfair to say, oh, it'll be confusing. Others figure it out, we can figure it out.
So how do you hope to see the campaign, whether for one side or the other, play out this summer? We had the Premier a few weeks ago saying he didn't quite frankly think people would be talking much about electoral reform or proportional representation. They'd be much happier around the summer barbecues than talking about this. I think they can do both, barbecue and talk about politics. But how do you hope, what's your kind of best scenario that you see playing out over the next 3 or 4 or 5 months?
Well, one of the things about the proportional representation advocates that I work with is they're on the ground now. We actually have a lot of very grassroots people who care about this stuff and will go out and knock on doors. My sense of the no side is that they're not really grassroots oriented. They're funded by large corporations. They don't have the same ground game that we do on the yes side. And so my strong sense is that there's an advantage to getting the information out early, getting the questions out early. For us, we want to get out there. We want to celebrate Canada Day with large yes banners and march and parades and that kind of stuff. So I am hoping the government moves on it, that it doesn't delay, as the Premier said, until after the summer. I think that would be handing the no side a real advantage, actually.
So British Columbians can expect to see the likes of you and others out across the province at various summer fairs and exhibitions
That's
and
right.
other kinds of
Yeah,
recreational
with
activities.
our information booths
Right.
and also knocking on doors. We've been knocking on doors for several months already, and people don't know that an election is coming. So we see it as partly our job to get out there, inform people, hey, a referendum is coming,
Right.
and it's going to really determine the future of British Columbia in terms of how our politics shapes up.
You mentioned funding and that the different sides are going to be funded potentially by people outside of BC or by the government. Can you explain to our viewers a little bit how the funding works for both campaigns?
The rules haven't been finally set yet at the time of this interview, and we should be hearing more within weeks. But it's generally understood that there will be public funding for both sides, the yes side and the no side. And there will also be some restrictions on funding by outside organizations like Fair Vote Canada, so that there's a level playing field. One of the problems in BC politics in the past has been massive funding by corporations and unions on either sides of these issues. And so I understand the plan is, and you might know more about this than I do, Michael, to have a level playing field so there's roughly equal funding for both sides. To me, that sounds like it's fair.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah.
Well, I think the whole credibility of this will be if people buy into it as an even-handed. I mean, there's been some controversy as well about the threshold of support, that it's not going to be 60 or 65%, that the government's saying 50% plus one. So I guess for you, part of that has to be the turnout. You've got to get a big voter turnout to make this seen as a credible, clear statement by citizens across the province.
Well, it's ironic because politicians often say, and actually the Premier of Prince Edward Island recently said this, and they had a referendum on proportional representation. The yes side won, we want change. And he said, well, there was a relatively small turnout. But of course, if you compare the turnout in referenda to turnout in municipal election, even provincial elections, and federal elections, often the turnout in those elections is very disappointing as well, right? And so politicians will say, well, in referenda we need high turnout, but in our own elections it's okay if there's low turnout, which seems a little bit unfair. The other thing is, first past the post, the academics who've studied these issues have shown that first past the post tends to depress turnout. There's an academic from California, Aaron Lipchart, who I'm sure you know, has found that roughly 6 or 7% advantage in terms of turnout for proportional representation countries. So one of the reasons for bringing in proportional representation, we say, is it increases turnout, it increases voter engagement because people's votes actually really do count to elect somebody. And so that's one of the pitches we make. Turnout is important. And proportional representation systems tend to have better turnout.
And that gives hence again the summer campaign. And even so for you, the campaign must have truly started months ago now.
It did. It started months ago. We've been knocking on doors. It's largely an information campaign at this point, trying to hear from people what they care about. And so we hear different things. Women are saying to us, what can we do about the underrepresentation of women? People in minority communities and other communities are saying, this isn't really relevant to us, or we're talking about why proportional representation makes our democratic process more relevant. So those are the kinds of conversations we're having on the doorstep.
You mentioned that you've started this campaign already. How is this going to differ from previous referendum campaigns?
We've looked back at that. We've looked at lessons learned from the yes side campaigns. One of the things that we're great at is people like me love talking about the technical details of STV and MMP and all this alphabet soup of different systems, right? And we've learned from difficult experience that actually voters want to know more practical things like, what's this going to do for me? What's this going to do in terms of environmental policy? What's this going to do for the representation of women? What's the evidence around balanced budget and fiscally responsible government? And so they don't really actually want to know that much about the details. They want to know about how is this going to help them as citizens, right? And there's a really good story to tell. I mean, you look at the academic work that's been done on this, women are better represented in PR systems, and even Afghanistan, with its difficult cultural issues, has better representation of women in their parliament than we do. We have 26%. They're way ahead of us, right? Sweden has the best at 45% women, and they're a PR country as well. So those are the kinds of conversations we have is, what are you interested in as a voter, and how does that fit with our current system as opposed to a new system? So those are we're trying to shift the conversation because we've learned from past failure that talking about, the statistics of preferential ballot voting is a really good way to lose a referendum.
Well, you can get lost in the details
Yeah,
really quickly,
easily.
can't you?
Yeah.
I think you're right. And I think one of our hopes over the coming segments is to talk about the principles, what's at stake in terms of value choices.
Yeah.
And also, as you just said, the outcomes or the consequences. What might a change mean for people in terms of their connection to a local MLA, the sense of accountability? Will it be just forever coalition governments or minority governments? What might that mean for budgets and, as you say, fiscal responsibility? Depending on people's own values, they'll project or they'll want to investigate what it might mean for what is near and dear to them.
The values point is an excellent point. People really, I think Canadian values are much more about cooperation, working together. And so, of course, when we're campaigning on the doorstep, we emphasize the values conversation.
Right.
And I think that is very important. People are turned off by the adversarial, tear down your opponent approach that we've seen with not just south of the border with the sort of toxic politics there, but also more and more in Canada. And I think the Stephen Harper approach to attack the enemy politics has really, I think, tainted our system. And we saw that in Justin Trudeau's Sunny Ways approach. And I think a lot of citizens in BC and Canada generally are saying there's got to be a better way of doing this. And that's what we're hoping to
You're
offer.
hoping third time the charm with a referendum in BC, I guess.
That's exactly right. We've learned from our lessons. We've learned lessons from the past. Now let's build a much more sort of positive, values-based, this is going to be better for you in these ways kind of campaign.
You touched on PEI and kind of the backtracking that happened. The federal Liberals also backtracked on their promise for proportional representation. Do you have some certainty that if this referendum goes through, that the current coalition government between the NDP or the
Greens,
that they'll actually follow through on?
I think it would be very, very hard to backtrack. I think in this context where both of the major parties, both of the governing parties, the Greens and the NDP, committed during the election campaign to this, it would be very hard, I think, to back away. And I think the Greens will hold the NDP accountable.
Absolutely. I think there's going to be national attention on this. I think, as you know, you're part of a national organization. There's going to be a lot of interest across other provinces. PEI is committed to another referendum too, I understand. So they'll be doing another try at this, but there'll be other jurisdictions that'll be looking. New Brunswick did talk about it some years back, but then kind of cooled off on it as well. Ontario. So
we're not an opportunity for BC to lead the way nationally. It really is.
Well, absolutely. And engage. I noticed, unlike, say, Scotland, which lowered the voting age and allowed 16 and 17-year-olds to engage in this, we're sticking with our standard voting age. But do you see this as a chance to reach out to younger people who aren't even going to get a chance to vote? On this one,
I think it's a chance for young people. It's a chance for women. It's going to be a big change if it comes through.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
Yeah.
So I think that's all the time we have.
Okay. So thank you for watching our first segment of this series on voting for change. Laurel and I want to thank our guest.
Thanks.
David, thank you much for helping us open up what we hope to be a series of conversations and community dialogue. And as you can gather from this show, we're going to try to stay at a higher level of values and some of the big choices and some of the consequences that mean something to you as British Columbians. Thank you for watching.